Hello and welcome to BitTitan's M365 Teams migration using MigrationWiz. My name is James Corbishley. I'm a Senior Technical Sales Specialist within the BitTitan team in EMEA, and I'd like to welcome you to today's session. First off, I'm going to give you a brief introduction into what and why you want to be using MigrationWiz. So MigrationWiz has been around for approximately 12 years. Originally, the requirement came from migrating Exchange 2007 data to BPOS. That's where our CEO, Jimin Yip, decided to develop a product to enable the ability to do that type of migration. And then obviously, moving from BPOS to Office 365 and now M365, Microsoft had developed additional workloads that need migrating, and BitTitan have followed that trend, allowing MigrationWiz to help facilitate those migration types. So MigrationWiz is a 100% SaaS tool. It's all based in Azure, and with our specialized guides, it means you don't need any special training or on-prem infrastructure or installations. And because of the guides, we have information relating to how to perform those migrations. It means you don't have to purchase expensive professional services to actually use the tool. It's just one simple UI for all workloads. It's also extremely scalable. Because it is 100% SaaS in the cloud, it means you don't have to provision additional workers. Whatever projects you throw at us, we will be able to manage for you. So MigrationWiz will migrate data as fast as it can from source to destination. It's also very secure and compliant. Obviously, using the Microsoft data centers means that there's a heavy set of security in the back end, which is constantly evolving. But we also have data centers situated around the globe, which will allow you to connect and use MigrationWiz so that data is only flowing through that regional data center. And that is obviously very important for compliance and data sovereignty requirements. Lastly, enterprise reliability. The tool, SaaS-based again, we have thousands of migrations happening every day, every hour of the day, to enable customers to migrate data in complex business scenarios like acquisitions, mergers and divestitures, particularly within tenant-to-tenant migration. So, some of the additional bits about MigrationWiz you can see here in the slide, showing you the actual dashboard. What this actually shows you are the workloads that are under management, so the different projects, but also the work groups you've got access to. And work groups allow what we call project sharing. So this allows the collaboration between employees within a company, or if you wish to invite a customer into a specific work group to access their own projects so that project managers can get visibility to these things, that's something we can do as well. We also use modern authentication mechanisms to connect to source and destination environments, particularly with tenant-to-tenant. We're using app-based auth where we can to enable secure connections to and from source and destination environments. And this obviously allows for a more secure connection. MigrationWiz is also famous for its very flexible migration approach. So the traditional kind of big bang approach where we can have pre-stage and then full migration passes is obviously a key part of MigrationWiz, but this will also enable you to facilitate quick switch migrations where you want to migrate the most recent data and then backfill after the migration of the user is completed. That's particularly useful when you're doing a divestiture under time pressures. Or you can obviously do the traditional staged approach where you want to move batches of users over at a specific time. Now, obviously becomes more complicated with the more workloads, particularly when you're using Teams, which is what we're going to discuss today. You do need to understand who has access to what and when Teams need to be migrated over. Lastly, the interface is accessible via any web browser. But alongside that, we also have the ability to use what we call our BitTitan SDK, which is basically a PowerShell SDK we've developed, which means that anything you can do in the UI, you can actually script, which enables enterprise migrations to be controlled and managed in a much more automated way to remove that human element risk. And we've got lots of customers that have developed very complicated scripts to create, start, report on projects and then kick off other internal processes as they're required. So just before we actually get into the full Teams to Teams demo, just a quick thing around tenant to tenant migrations. Some stats we've got from last year. Obviously, we've seen a huge increase within the current global climate with COVID. We've seen a huge amount of uptake of tenant to tenant migrations for consolidation reasons or divestitures, etc. So we have migrated well over 1 million users with about 10,000 tenant to tenant migrations. So we are used extensively globally across many different business verticals to do these types of migrations. And we do support the different workloads expected within a tenant to tenant migration. So that's Exchange Online, primary mailbox to primary mailbox, archive to archive if you've got that E3 or E5 license enabled. Recoverable items can also be migrated from your primary mailbox or from the legal hold areas between tenants, and that's key for financial institutions or healthcare institutions that need to do these types of migrations. OneDrive to OneDrive, SharePoint Online to SharePoint Online, Teams to Teams, which is obviously I'm going to dive into more here. And last but not least, we do still enable the migration of public folder data from tenant to tenant, either directly to the destination public folders, or we can migrate to shared folders as well on the destination. So let's dig into Teams to Teams migrations. Again, a few stats. We've re-architected our solution over the last 12 months. It's much more robust. We can now migrate up to 30 concurrent teams at any time, which is obviously going to help with the top of the velocity migrations for larger enterprise type deals that we work with. I've got some stats there on the slide. So averaging around 500 teams with approximately, between 0.5 to 1 terabyte of data per day. So pretty good velocity. You're talking at large scale migrations, and you can see some of the stats there. Over 190,000 users with 45,000 teams have been migrated. And we have some very large enterprises looking to use our tool to migrate large amounts of teams. Now we kind of dig into a little bit on the slide as well about what we can actually migrate, but I'm going to go into that into more depth later on. First of all, let's talk about having migration success when you're doing a Teams to Teams migration. And that involves a couple of key steps. So of course, before you actually migrate any data, you need to understand what you have on your source, and perhaps you need to understand what is on your destination as well. So on the source, we have the ability to do an assessment to access and deliver reports based on that source environment. And we have a tool called Velia, which will allow that. So that's a BitTitan product called Velia. That will actually provide insight into what is on your source, a whole ton of information relating to number of teams, users, names of teams, etc. And that's key, obviously, to understand what you might want to migrate and what is also on the destination. So you can actually perform this assessment on the destination to see if you've got any naming conflicts, etc. Prior to that migration. So that's key to understand what you want to migrate and to where. Then obviously working with MigrationWiz, you can migrate the data. That's obviously key. I'm going to talk a lot about that today. And then once you've completed the migration, you may wish to do some ongoing management. So to understand, again, through the Velia reporting and assessment tools, what is actually in use, what is adopted, and maybe a way of governing data. Our Velia templates also allow you to do things like channel copy, intra-tenant, and archive channels as well. So quickly on Velia, what is Velia and how does it work? So Velia, again, is a fully SaaS-based product. You simply go to velia.com, create a workspace, and when you're actually logged in, you'll see a library of out-of-the-box automations that will allow you to do specific tasks. There are many different types of automations, including assessments, both for Teams and for Office 365. Again, information relating to those source and destination tenants. We've even got an assessment to allow you to extract information about public folders as well. But by clicking on and running through a simple steps that are identified within the Valir runbook, you can track the process of exactly what's happening and the progress of actually what is actually being extracted and reported on, and then you'll get the information relating to that assessment based in a CSV or Excel, and then you can actually continually automate this as well, so you can have continued reporting available whenever you need to, so on a daily basis, weekly basis, whatever. So let's look at the actual Teams Valir assessment. It's what you can see on the slide deck here, and I've got the URL linked at the top in the red box. But this really does provide some excellent level of details around the usage of Teams within your environment. So list of private and public channels, guests, access of which users into which team, information related to the top 5 channel sizes relating by size, and then a lot of information relating to the estimated requirement of licensing. So when you use MigrationWiz, how many licenses will you need to migrate all of the teams that you have in scope on the source? So lots of really, really good information there. It's actually currently available free for 30 days at the moment, so thoroughly recommend that you do that. Okay, let's dive into Teams and talk about the Teams to Teams migration using MigrationWiz. So the first step you want to do when you're actually doing a migration with any MigrationWiz workload is to actually read the guides. And we have some very extensive help center guides, migration guides, and information relating to all of our different workloads. But with relating to Teams, you can see I've got a little snapshot there of information we have relating to Teams migrations. But the actual guides have very, very detailed information on how to perform a Teams migration. So even if you've never actually done a migration, you can go and read that information and have a really clear understanding of what you need to do. Now, what are the prerequisites on the source and destination in terms of permissioning you needed? How do you extract team data? How do you set up the MigrationWiz project? Some of the advanced options you need to set, some of the things you need to consider when actually performing the migration, and what you can and can't migrate. So some of the other key things you might need to think about are some of the best practices, and obviously FAQs around troubleshooting, error lookup, etc. And also some of the advanced options around filtering and specific scenarios for things like username changes, etc. So what does MigrationWiz migrate from Teams to Teams? It's pretty key to help your customers understand exactly what they're going to be migrating. So we migrate the teams and channels, and that includes private channels, the teams and channel settings, so that's team pictures, mentions, tags, etc. The conversation posts within those teams and channels, obviously. Documents associated with those teams and channels, including metadata and versioning, and that's key to enable you to do that kind of pre-stage migration pass prior to doing a cutover of the documents. OneNote, notebooks and tabs, planner data and tabs, so all the buckets and tasks, task lists, etc. will be migrated. And we also allow the migration of private chat. So within Teams, obviously, there's extensive use of private chat. Now, due to some limitations, we cannot migrate that directly and rehydrate that into the destination team currently, although that is slated for release by the end of the year. But right now we can do that private chat migration as part of a mailbox migration. And that's because the mailbox holds a hidden folder with that chat information, and that's one-to-one chat, group chat, and meeting chat. And as I mentioned, coming soon, private chat rehydration by the end of the year, but also the ability to migrate or copy over those additional tabs. So things like connections to different Office, so Word, PDFs, etc., wiki tabs, and any connection to document library SharePoint sites. Okay, let's talk about actually setting up the project. So MigrationWiz is pretty simple in the way it works. The key is having two endpoints. So you set up a source endpoint to obviously read data from the source, and a destination endpoint to write to the destination. Now, based on best practices to avoid throttling limitations, etc., we actually use app-based authentication on both source and destination teams. So when you actually read the guides, we have a URL that you click on, and that will allow you then to register the app with the required permissions. You can see a little screenshot there on what you're allowing MigrationWiz to access on the source and on the destination. This provides a secure connection to allow MigrationWiz to then access the data, read the data from the source, and write to the destination. Then to actually create the endpoint account, you just literally create a cloud-only user with a Teams license attached to it, and then you add that into a security group called MigrationWiz. And that user is used as the endpoint admin within MigrationWiz, which will then bind to the app-based auth that you've already registered in your tenant, which allows connection to read and write the data. If you have any specific requirements relating to delegate permissions, so there are some customers that do not allow full access to the source and destination tenant, we do allow delegated permissions so that you can actually specify and add a team admin account into the source to read data, so that only specific teams can be migrated. Right, when we actually look at the MigrationWiz UI, you'll see here, this is the simple interface that you see, and it's very similar for all the different workloads. But you simply put in some project information, which is basically what the project, or what you want to call the project, and a customer name, which is a container, which basically just allows you to differentiate different projects for different customers. And then you get into being able to create the source and destination settings. So you can see on the screen here, I've set up a source Teams endpoint, obviously connected to the source, and I've added in that, I've obviously done the delegated permission access already, but then I've added in that Teams user as my admin endpoint, or endpoint admin. You do that for the same for the destination settings, and then when you get to project summary, you'll get some information relating to what you've configured. So obviously source and destination, and then all the items that are available for migration. And you also get some reminders on the knowledge base articles that are available. You should have obviously already read this information, but you may need to just have a quick look at some of the troubleshooting error lookups if you encounter any issues. And last but not least, very, very important, are the advanced options. Advanced options can enable you to do many different parts of the migration. So not only set up the advanced options relating to things like being able to migrate private channels, but also put in specific mapping for username changes. So if your domain suffix or usernames are changing, you can add user mapping to make sure that the memberships are copied over correctly. You can set notifications. You can set the Azure data center through which the data is going to be migrated. And you can also set the number of document versions that you wish to migrate. And we actually can migrate up to 25 versions, although that will obviously increase the length of time to migrate the data. So by default, we recommend 3. You can even drop it down to 1 if that's not of importance. That will obviously speed up your migration. So once you've actually set up the project, you'll next need to add the teams into MigrationWiz. Obviously, without adding them in, you won't be able to migrate them. And we have a pretty easy function called Auto Discover that will actually do a discovery on the source using the source endpoint information. We'll actually pull the source teams into an automated import mechanism. As you can see here, click on this little green import items, which will pull those teams directly into the project. Or if you wanted to, if you've got thousands of teams and you only wanted to add a few individual teams in, you can use the bulk add option to import those, or you can simply do it manually by adding each user, each team in manually using the mail nickname of that team. Now once you've actually set and added those users in, then you can actually see the source and destination teams and the pairing, if you like, or the matching between source and destination. Now by default we call the destination team the same as the source, but you can go in and actually edit each line item to a different destination team name. If you wanted to edit or add a suffix, for example, we can do things like that, but it will allow you some flexibility on where the data is being migrated to. And then when you actually come to perform the migration, you've got the ability, when you click on the start icon, you always can do a verify credentials. What that verify credentials will allow you to do is to check to make sure the source and destination tenant is available. So obviously you wouldn't have a destination team necessarily created first, but it will create to make sure you've got the endpoint admin set up, all of the app-based authentication is set up, and basically sets you up to ensure you've got the project set up for success. Then when you click on full migration, this is how you actually kick things off. So when you first run that full migration pass, the first step is to set up the destination teams. Now you can do this yourselves, but obviously this is an automated mechanism that will actually create those teams in the destination for you, so you don't have to go and do that manually. Now this will obviously read information from the source and create that team on the destination based on the mail nickname from the source in the destination. But because obviously the provisioning has to happen in the MigrationWiz backend, you need to wait at least 1 hour before attempting any data migration. And when we move into the data migration phase, you'll see there all the different selections you have available. And what we recommend is that you take this in steps. So on the previous deck I showed you some information relating to which steps you should take, but the first initial migration you want to do is to migrate conversations, documents with the actual OneNote data, document metadata and versioning, and then you can actually migrate the document permissions if required. The document permissions are actually the explicit permissions based within SharePoint. Now, most customers that I've worked with use Teams permissions or Teams membership to set access to those documents. So usually, for the majority of cases, document permissions aren't required and you rely on the team membership. But if you have explicit permissions set on the document level, you can actually migrate those as well. So that's the first migration pass. So you'd actually kick off and do a first migration pass of that. And then when that's completed, you would come back in and you could do another iteration of the pass, but then include the OneNote tabs. Okay, because the OneNote data has been created prior to the tab will then be able to bind to that OneNote notebook in the back end and be created. And then with this other iteration of document migration, you will be bringing over potentially new versions of the document if anything has changed on the source. So this helps with a more robust migration mechanism, meaning that you can perform multiple passes of that document data, which will allow newer versions to be brought across. And then last but not least, that's when you want to migrate Planner and then the Teams permissions. So Teams permissions, or memberships as we also call it, you want to do this last because the users will not get an email notification during the initial migrations, basically to say that you're a member of this new team. And Planner needs to be migrated with those memberships because that's what assigns the users to the specific tasks within the Planner tab, or tasks and buckets, etc. So you can perform multiple passes of documents, as I've stated, but we do recommend that 3-step approach for the different workloads within Teams to Teams. Okay, once the migration is completed, what actually does the information look like? So you'll notice here the conversations on the destination. What we actually do is we encapsulate that chat, or sorry, that conversation within a post that's actually created by the endpoint account. Okay, which means that you do rely, it remains replyable, but also keeps the integrity of the user who actually originally posted that, and the time and date stamp, which we convert into UTC. So that's very useful for those historical information. Now, by default, we actually migrate 60 posts per Teams, but this can be increased to 1,000 with advanced options, meaning that if you've got 10 teams, that would be 100 posts per team. But if you have more conversations than that, then we will actually write those additional posts into an HTML document behind a conversation history tab, which you can see in the slide deck there. In terms of teams and channels, etc., you'll see obviously teams and associated channels are migrated, including private channels, as long as you make sure you add the advanced option in. And then when you run that last teams permissions, all of the teams and channel memberships are also migrated, assuming that the destination user is available in that destination tenant. This also includes the ability to migrate guest accounts, as long as the source and destination has guest account created. In terms of documents and metadata I mentioned before, we can migrate this over. So you see here all the modified data, etc. has been migrated over. Important to note, obviously, in terms of versioning, you'll have different versions that you can actually get access to because they've been migrated over. Moving into the OneNote notebooks and planner tabs, you'll notice that those in the actual slide here, the demo notebook tab has been created, and obviously you've got the back-end notebook equivalent that's been migrated, and planner can be migrated as well. So you see the test plan there, and we've migrated the plans, buckets, tasks, task details. There are some nuances around the task details due to limitations in the APIs. We use the Graph API. We cannot migrate some specific task detail. That's all detailed within our guides. Now, I talked about private chat before. As I mentioned, this is not part of Teams to Teams migration, but can be a very key part to a migration of Teams to Teams. So we actually facilitate that via a mailbox migration. And what you can see here on the left-hand side is we create a folder called Migrated Teams Chat, and then we'll migrate all of those different chat types. So one-to-one chat, meeting chat, and peer-to-peer chat as well. So that's important. Obviously, as it's in your mailbox, it means that you can search that and you'll have access to information that you've had on your source tenant, useful for compliance purposes. Obviously, it does not mean that it's going to be rehydrated into Teams, but hopefully we'll have that available for you by the end of the year, as I mentioned before. Now, what else do you get in terms of once you've completed the migration? You get some pretty cool analytics, project overview and statistics available via the UI. So you get information on speeds, what has been migrated in a very sort of detailed way. But you can also request a CSV of statistics via email as well. So you'll get all this information in an Excel spreadsheet. Now, of course, every project sometimes has some issues. Again, we try and make this as easy as possible for you. It'll allow you to actually access the status of each team migration. You'll notice here a failure due to verification because a source team could not be found, but very robust sort of self-help errors and reporting in the UI. And we also have 24/7 global support coverage, which is included within the license cost, obviously available to you to log tickets for any assistance. And last but not least, we have a new feature or new function of the customer success team, which means you can purchase customer onboarding to take you through some of these steps as well if you need to. So that's it from today. Teams to Teams migration with MigrationWiz. Very simple, easy process. I recommend highly you have a look at our product. Talk to our sales team. We will be able to provide you with some test licensings if necessary. So thank you for listening and your time today. Please visit bittitan.com and start migrating today. Thank you. Goodbye.